big international news coming in today where a historic vote finally saw and is set to see the ouster of the French Prime Minister. The France far right and the left-wing lawmakers came together in a no-confidence vote that was prompted by budget disputes and ousted the Prime Minister and his cabinet members, first for France since 1962. A conservative appointed in September, Barnier becomes the shortest-serving Prime Minister in France's modern history. And the French President Macron now has to pick his sixth Prime Minister in 7 years. He remains in office, he remains untouched by these developments, but what happens is that not only is his political capital eroded to some extent, how will he pass his budget? Because elections cannot take place till next year. So how is he going to ensure that with a fractured polity, he will be able to pass the budget? And that is a big question, with many opposition politicians increasingly calling for Macron to now resign. But he has insisted he will serve the full term out. All right, let's quickly now get in Mr. Nicholas joining us live from England to fill us in with how he views this situation and how he feels this is really likely to pan out. Nicholas, appreciate you taking out the time and speaking to me on India Global. As things stand right now, the political logjam that Paris has been in ever since the elections this year, it was a snap election. Why Macron did it is a separate story, and what was he thinking is a separate story. But the fact is that the fractured polity in France is impacting or is set to impact the legislative business.
Well, yes, indeed. And I hesitate to criticize a neighboring country with which Britain has a very close relationship. But looked at from our perspective, they have a rather awkward democracy because firstly, they elect a president, and then the president chooses the prime minister and indeed the government and leaves it for them to run within Parliament. So the president himself is not directly accountable to Parliament. And the Prime Minister he's chosen has had a job trying to steer the boat, as it were, not least, as you say, because of the budget, the importance of getting a budget passed. I don't have a solution to this, but more to the point, nor does France. That's the worst aspect. You had these elections, these surprise elections held in July, that nobody really expected the president to call elections at that time.
Exactly.
Especially since it was just before the Olympic Games were held in Paris.
Exactly.
And now we have another political démarche just before President-designate Trump of the United States is due in Paris. And it looks like there won't be a government in place.
I was going to come to just that at a time when Europe is set to face a lot of uncertainty in terms of what happens to their ties with America, what happens to NATO, what happens to all of those institutions. There's also a crisis that France has, well, frankly, created for itself, which is what happens to France going forward in the midst of growing geopolitical uncertainty.
I think you know it so well, you don't really need me. But anyway, I agree with the points you're making. And this is really why France matters, because of its relationship with other countries. It is a key state within the European Union, and the other key state, Germany, is also in a bit of a mess with elections due in February. And both France and Germany have big economic problems, and there's a question is being asked as to whether the leadership of the European Union will move further east, with both France and Germany having difficulties, and indeed having governments that haven't lasted long. I mean, the German ones lasted a bit longer, but the French one only 3 months, as you say. Now, beyond that, there's a whole question of NATO. And NATO is a very important alliance for much of Europe. And the uncertainty created by the election of President Trump has got NATO in a bit of jitters. So the solidarity, which, I mean, that's one area where Britain and France are in the alliance together. I think there are 27 countries in NATO altogether. And that matters because of the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war, I should say.
Yes.
So much uncertainty in Paris, but it reaches way beyond the economic of the European Union in an economic sense,
and
throughout NATO in a defense and security sense. So we outsiders, I mean, we European outsiders are considerably concerned about what's going on in France and the apparent lack of any obvious way forward, because, as you say, elections by law cannot be held, new elections cannot be held until July next year. And President Macron, I think his term runs till 2027. So if he doesn't want to step down, he won't step down. But how else do you resolve a crisis where Parliament is split roughly three ways, with none of those three groups or parties having an overall majority?
Exactly.
It's a big political crisis.
Which brings me to ask you this, that it took 6 weeks to appoint the last Prime Minister. Now, who could possibly replace him? Because somebody needs to be the next Prime Minister. Legislative business has to continue. Budget has to pass. In your assessment, who could that be? And what will it take for parties to really come together behind a candidate?
Well, you're asking absolutely the questions that we're all wondering. I read in the papers this morning that there are 2 or 3 names being toyed with, people from one of the political groups who seem to be better at getting on with the other groups than clearly Mr. Barnier was. So there are names in the ring, but as to how long it'll take to appoint a new Prime Minister, the expectation is that Mr. Macron, to save himself really, will appoint somebody before President Trump arrives at the weekend. So it's got to be within 2 or 3 days. So there are candidates, but what you won't see happen is that one of the prominent party leaders will be appointed, because, well, arguably they're part of the problem. They are rowing, and the ability to create a coalition from this divided parliament seems minimal. But partly because of President Trump coming, and partly because of the need to get a budget through. When the Prime Minister resigned, the draft budget collapsed. So there are 2 very pressing reasons why Mr. Macron has to move fast. The call for him to resign himself, to step down and call a presidential election, well, it seems less likely that that'll happen, but it's not impossible. It certainly won't happen before the weekend, that's for sure.
All right, let's leave it there. Mr. Nicholas Nugent, thank you so much for taking out the time and really connecting the dots in terms of what's happening in France right now.